Welcome to the Filmanalysis, today with Rambo, First Blood, as well as parts 2, 3 and 4. To this day, the Rambo series remains highly controversial. Critics suppose the films to be reactionary and suggest a perpetrator-victim reversal. Rambo was meant to fight imperialist wars. It was all about coming to terms with trauma from the Vietnam War. Without a doubt, the first part of the series represents a masterpiece and still carries some of that beautiful new Hollywood grittiness, even though it dates from 1982. The elite fighter John Rambo returns home from Vietnam. He once belonged to the Green Berets. He now wants to visit a comrade, but learns that this comrade has died of cancer caused by his time in Vietnam. Afterwards, a sheriff from the small town of Hope kicks Rambo out, telling him to disappear and stay out of town. When Rambo resists, he is locked up in jail and abused. Memories of Vietnam's torture prisons flutter up. Rambo manages to escape from jail and runs into the forest. He fights not only the local police but also the state police called to help. Rambo escapes into the forest and becomes the Vietnam warrior again. Only his former instructor, Colonel Troutman, finally stops him. By then, Rambo has turned the small town of Hope into a gigantic battlefield. The civilian world thus learns about the Vietnam War. At the end, the taciturn Rambo laments his suffering, telling Troutman when he arrived at the airport, he was not greeted honorably, not hero-like, but insulted by demonstrators. Due to the final statement, many have regarded Rambo as a reactionary right-wing film. According to those critics, it seemed terribly historical revisionist to blame the demonstrators for the soldiers' trauma. As if the war developed its nature because of the demonstrators. But does Rambo's statement truly explain everything? It's rather a character speech, not representing the entire film. Let's take a closer look at who is making Rambo's life difficult. First, there is the intolerant sheriff calling Rambo a deadbeat. There are police officers abusing their power and the men who have formed themselves into vigilantes who now want to hunt Rambo down too. In short, right-wing America is fighting a Vietnam War returnee, not liberal intellectuals and not demonstrating students. Rambo's closing speech, however, is designed to distract from just that. The accusation of perpetrator-victim reversal therefore does not fully apply. Rather, it is a matter of a shift. We do not learn what Rambo did in the war. We may assume that he also killed brutally, most probably civilians as well. In this respect, a reversal sets in. Rambo is now staged as a victim, but he is also a victim in this society. Bernd Greiner has written a great study on Vietnam War, War Without Fronts, the USA in Vietnam. Greiner describes the Special Forces unit by the likes of Rambo's and quotes a former combatant. All the time we were lurking in ambush, we became Viet Cong. That really matters regarding Rambo. He too transforms back into a Viet Cong. Greiner continues, the Special Forces stepped into the role of the Empire's guards, forward posts on the periphery and specialists in the unconventional. Lone wolves who achieved their goals all the more quickly the freer they were in their decisions and choice of means. Black overalls or green camouflage suits with tiger patterns were their trademark. Exotic paint jobs, futuristic weapons and a casual demeanor cemented their reputation as true believers in the long tradition of lone heroes. One has to look long and hard to find a worldview construction that so skillfully reconciles the anarchic in the American self-image and the anti-institutional effects associated with it with the job description of the professional military." End of quote. This paradoxical figure Greiner describes is found again in Rambo. Surprisingly, we witness a heroic subject originating from a Western, not fitting into modern society, like Rambo, who therefore leaves this society, the city, and moves into the forest. Rambo represents a paradoxical figure. He is anarchic, he acts as he pleases, he rejects institutions, but at the same time he is subject to the military in the person of Colonel Trautmann. In a way, he is also a victim. Greiner writes, "More than at any other time in American history, members from the bottom third of the social spectrum bore to brunt of the war. More than anything else, social affiliation determined the likelihood of having to fight and being exposed to the risk of dying." End of quote. The US recruited soldiers mainly from the working class and the poor, while the upper class studied. We may guess where Rambo is coming from. It is not the demonstrators, but the powerful who are to blame for Rambo's trauma. It is not those who demonstrate against the war fighting against the soldiers. Rather, the suffering arises from those sending soldiers to war. Unsurprisingly, quite some soldiers deserted the Vietnam War. What about the perpetrators? It is no longer the guerrilla fighters, the Viet Cong, but the America that Rambo fought for, which now becomes Rambo's enemy. Rambo now seems to become not only outwardly a Viet Cong, he turns into a guerrilla fighter, fighting an asymmetrical war against a regular army of policemen. An army made up of people who don't care about existing rights. The US Army's criminal behavior in Vietnam now finds its counterpart in the fight against Rambo. We should consistently interpret the film against the reading suggested by Rambo at the end of the film and ask who represents the oppressed people. Certainly not the police, who, like the army in Vietnam, only represent the ruling class's interests, combined with some resentment. The parallel with Vietnam War is clear when Trautmann warns the police about a war they cannot win. In other words, exactly what happened to the army. Colonel Trautmann does not represent the people either. Trautmann holds an outsider position, but after all, the Pentagon sends him and he belongs to the military. Interestingly, the civilians do not represent the people either. They are not allying with Rambo, but with the police. Some citizens even hunt Rambo with their own shotguns. Instead, Rambo represents the oppressed people. He cannot find a job. He is disregarded and discriminated against, a victim of the imperialist campaign. The film reaches astonishingly far. Rambo is waging a war against his own country, or rather against the people ruling his country, a guerrilla war. By referring to the demonstrators, the film merely softens its own radicalism, drawing the revolutionary sting. In the end, Rambo is imprisoned and only released for the second part to travel once more to Vietnam to free prisoners of war there. Now the underdog aesthetic also changes, reminiscent of New Hollywood. With Rambo 2, it shifts toward the official aesthetic of blockbuster cinema, a bit of a B-movie and above all war propaganda. Rambo is transformed into a guerrilla on behalf of the state, an archaic warrior in a highly modern army forced to submit to new irregular wars. Only the heroic subject, Rambo, who faces the enemy directly, can make a difference against those who are ready to die at any moment. The Rambo series states at one point, live for nothing or die for something. Rambo here matches his enemies. He also shatters the US military's computers at the end of the second film. The modern world and Rambo have nothing in common. Meaning, as with the special forces in Vietnam, the laws of war are broken, undermined, or circumvented. With Rambo, everything is permitted. He takes no prisoners. Peculiarly, in the parts 2, 3 and 4, Rambo not only behaves as he was taught in his training, but heeds Mao Zedong's advice to guerrilla warriors, namely to behave like a fish in water. In all 4 films, Rambo does what Che Guevara also expected of a guerrilla in his book Guerrilla Warfare. Rambo follows this, being silently tenacious. He can doctor himself, he attacks with purpose, he wastes ammunition only in the final action spectacle, but otherwise relies on well-aimed shots. He also tends to attack infrastructure and operates in rural areas where the guerrilla warrior naturally feels at home. Rambo sometimes allies with the people. Che Guevara writes, "In order not to be defeated in battle, the guerrillero must take advantage of the situation, grow into his environment and render the surrounding conditions his allies." End of quote. In Rambo's case, this is evident as he does not fight in a uniform. Che Guevara continues, "The guerrilla fighter must have a degree of adaptability that will permit him to identify himself with the environment in which he lives, to become a part of it, and to take advantage of it as his ally to the maximum possible extent. He also needs a faculty of rapid comprehension and instantaneous inventiveness that will permit him to change his tactics according to the dominant course of the action. These faculties of adaptability and inventiveness in popular armies are what ruin the statistics of the warlords and cause them to waver." End of quote. Rambo differs from official military. Che Guevara supposes the guerrilla to follow an ideal of liberating the oppressed people. Rambo 2, in parts 2, 3 and 4, represents a people, mingles with the inhabitants, cooperates, establishes trust and always liberates a people to be liberated. However, according to the official definition of the USA, Rambo is and always will be a US warrior, as Rambo 3 from 1988 illustrates. In it, Rambo fights together with the Mujahideen against the Soviets. You can't defeat a people like that, is said about the Afghans in the film. We already had our Vietnam, now the Soviets will have theirs, they say. This anticipates to some extent the failure of the US in Afghanistan. Rambo takes up the bow and arrow again, not just technology, as in part 4, where Rambo frees an aid group from the clutches of the military junta in Burma. The brutality bothered many when the film was released. However, the 4th part, set in Burma, could have taken place in Vietnam, but it was carried out by US soldiers who also burned villages and shot women and children. The 4th film, contains a certain documentary style, a retrospective documentary about the Vietnam War. Not only a film can reverse the perpetrator-victim relationship, we too can relate to the film in a different way. It is our freedom of interpretation. Because Rambo is such a paradoxical, such an enigmatic figure, a figure fighting on so many fronts, he allows for counterintuitive interpretations. In addition, Rambo sides with the spectator. Military people of the official Pentagon may sympathize, but completely different people may as well. It always depends on how the viewer positions himself, determining whether you just watch these films or see them.
It would be nice if you would like to support the Filmanalysis financially. You can do so via my bank account or PayPal. Also, you can find me on Patreon. Thank you very much.